In the early 1990s, the northern cod fisheries collapsed, along with capelin stocks, their food. And 30 years later, the cod stocks or capelin stocks haven't been the same. We're going to talk about it on today's episode of Ocean Talk. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of Ocean Talk. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is a show where I talk all things oceans so you can be made more aware of what's happening in the ocean and how you can live for a better ocean by taking action. Now, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about northern cod stocks, one of the most infamous fishery stocks known to man. Why? Not because of their beauty, not because they taste really good, although they do taste really good, but because of their fisheries collapse in the early 1990s and the moratorium that was declared after which, because there was nothing really to catch back then. And so they had to put a moratorium thinking that the fishery stocks would actually come back, maybe 5-10 years later. But 30 years later, we still haven't seen a recovery. And in fact, it was just declared in the latest meetings for those fishery stocks that the northern cod stocks have actually stalled. So the population has stalled in growth. Not a very good sign, and that means more restrictions for these fisheries. I want to give you a little bit of history on these fisheries because we have to go back to even in the 1800s and early 1900s when cod fisheries were huge. Cod fishery was one of the biggest fisheries along the East Coast. There was also haddock and halibut, but cod fisheries is really what made the East Coast so great. There were talks of fishermen being able to put buckets in the water, and as soon as they pulled it out, they would be able to have a bucket full of fish. And since then, the cod fisheries has been the major catch along the East Coast of Canada and even the Northeast coast of the US. However, people got greedy. They just kept fishing and fishing and fishing, and they weren't managing the stocks properly. We've heard this story time and time again with other fishery stocks, but this was the stock that really made us think about how we need to manage fisheries. So from the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, fishery scientists started to see declines of the northern cod, and it kept declining and declining and declining. Fishery scientists in Canada were saying, hey, politicians here, we need to start talking about these cod stocks, and we need to make sure that we are putting the right quotas on the right stocks in the right places because we're starting to see a decrease in the population. Politicians had pressure from the fishing industry, and then nothing would happen. The politicians would just kind of say, okay, we're just going to continue with these quotas, and that's the end of it. Well, then the collapse happened. Early 1990s, a moratorium on the cod stock were put into place, and there was no more cod fishing. With that, the capelin stocks, which is a small fish that's a prey item for the northern cod, also collapsed and has never been the same since. So every year since then, there's been a stock assessment, and that stock assessment triggers meetings with a number of different stakeholders. So you have the fishing industry, you have government, you have nonprofit organizations that are interested in making sure that fishery stocks are handled properly. And those meetings happen, and they set the stage for what the fishery is going to happen in the new season. So since then, there hasn't really been a fishery, although there has been a recreational fishery. I did an interview with Rebecca Sines, and she had this to say about the recreational fishery. Okay.
There's also fishing on cod. It's not commercially recognized. There's a food fishery and recreational activity, and a stewardship fishery to gain scientific data and also to support the Newfoundland economy.
Okay, so I was aware of the stewardship fishery. That was with, I think it's with WWF, right? Is strongly involved in that. Is that correct? Or there was a pilot study that may have been a number of years ago, I thought. But is there somebody else involved in that?
The fishing industry in Newfoundland engages in the stewardship fishery, the inshore fleet.
Okay. Now, I didn't realize there was still a fishery for, sort of food and recreational. How is that managed?
So currently, it's not really regulated. There's, a limit on how many cod you can keep, but there isn't really a monitoring system in place. So there isn't a license requirement or a requirement to fill in something like a logbook.
Really?
And so for a long time, that has been an unreported catch, right? So something this new assessment accounted for this time was some uncertainty in the level of catches, which would include a baseline of what the recreational fishery is catching.
One of the frustrating parts of learning that there is a recreational and a stewardship fishery is the fact that they're not really tracking the fishery. It gets me a little frustrated when you have this infamous stock that collapsed 30 years ago and we're still not tracking this data. This is something that can happen pretty easily. Fishers can take part, and they can have fisheries observers also take part to make sure that the data is accurate. And so I hope in the future they will start tracking this, but for now they're not going to do so. Regardless, there are meetings every year. We're Indigenous groups, organizations, nonprofit organizations like Oceana Canada, where Rebecca Skynes works, as well as government get together, in the fisheries industry, get together and they talk about the numbers. There's science meetings for a few days and they talk about the science, they talk about where the stocks are at, how they came up with the models, how they should include new model data. They start to assess the stock every year. In the past, in October 2023, the stock was just above the critical level. And now, with adding new data in 2024, they added it a little bit higher than the cautionary data, which is a little bit above the critical line. With that said, the population has also been assessed as stalling in growth. So that means that even though it's above the cautionary level, the population can actually go dip below the cautionary reference point and into the critical level. And that is not what we want. Now, the capelin are the same. They're at the critical level, but the fisheries industry is asking for more data to be applied to that model so that it can also be they're predicting that it'll be pushed above the critical level into the cautionary level. Either way, it doesn't mean that we can do any kind of fishing. Although the fishing industry is pushing that they should open up the fishery for commercial fishing. Of course, that's not going to happen this year, but that was the push from the fishing industry. Needless to say, this is not a good sign over the next few years for this stall in population growth. These models have been in place for a long time, and the accuracy is getting better and better every year. So the management of these stocks are dependent on these models. To improve the fishery, strategies like ecosystem-based management and sustainable management practices are implemented. And to give you a brief definition, ecosystem-based management is where the entire ecosystem that these northern cod will be managed within and even beyond is going to be managed all together. It's not just going to be managed with the fish. It's not going to be managed with just their prey, the capelin. It's going to be managed on an entire habitat to habitat to habitat level. That means all the habitats and all the communities that reside within this ecosystem, within this area that's being studied, is going to be assessed and is going to be looked at in terms of protection. When we talk about protection, we talk about implementing marine protected areas for fisheries. And this is something that should be considered along the entire East Coast, is a network of marine protected areas so that we can put those in place and we can manage the northern cod stocks as well as the capelin stocks and anything that resides within this ecosystem so that we can have not only better fishery stocks, but also just better habitat for these fisheries. And I think that is where the key is when it comes into managing fishery stocks, is we need to ensure that we are putting in the right management practices, looking at a holistic approach, meaning we're looking at everything, ecosystem. So if there's a number of different habitats within this ecosystem and the northern cod can depend on those, then that's what we're accounting for. We're accounting for all the things that we don't know is going to happen that may or may not affect the northern cod and the capelin stocks. So we're going to protect the entire place and we're going to manage it properly. And there are a number of papers and a number of research projects that have been put out, published in scientific journals, as well as other places that are white papers. And there have been many examples of how marine protected areas can benefit fisheries and benefit biodiversity, which will eventually benefit fisheries anyway. So there's a lot of things that can be put into place. It just has to be done. Putting together an ecosystem-based management plan as well as a marine protected area takes a lot of people, a lot of different stakeholders, like I mentioned earlier in this video: Indigenous stakeholders, fishery stakeholders, government, nonprofit organizations. All of these different users of the ocean need to have a say to ensure that we are going to make that this ecosystem-based management plan is going to be adhered to. So that's how we manage northern cod stocks and capelin stocks, as well as the ecosystem and the habitats that lie within them. And that is our episode for today. So I hope this made you more aware of what's happening with the northern cod stocks, a little bit of an update. I would love to hear your comments on what you think should be done with these cod stocks and capelin stocks on the east coast of Newfoundland. Just put in your comments comment down below, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. And if you want to hear more details on my interview with Rebecca Skynes from Oceana Canada, you can do so by clicking on the link in the description below. It'll take you to the audio podcast, How to Protect the Ocean podcast, which is my podcast that I host. I did an interview with her for about almost an hour. You get all the details into the meetings, into Northern Cod stocks, the Capelin stocks, and everything that goes with it. So check that out in the link in the description below, and I'll talk to you next time. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Ocean Talk. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. Talk to you next episode, and happy conservation.